only attentive, but also have some questions for her. All right. Thank you, Sylvia, for joining us. I appreciate you taking the time and sharing your expertise.
You're welcome, Lori, and thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Nice to see everyone on the screen. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and to talk about child welfare in general and just my career. It's always an honor when people ask me to do that, because I don't think it's very special, but I do think all of you that choose the field of, anybody that chooses the field of child welfare certainly is special, because I think it's a very hard job and it's not the job for everybody. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how I got into the field of child welfare. I always joke with Lori about my undying love for the field of child welfare, and just kind of the variety of things I got to do while I was moving throughout the organization in child welfare, the different positions, and then a little bit about why I left probably earlier. This gray hair is the result of child welfare, but I think a little bit about where I think the field should be going, and if any of you, if you're choosing the field of child welfare, hopefully you'll take some of those thoughts with you as you begin your career there. But when I finished my undergraduate degree, I actually moved to Colorado, to the state of Colorado, and I had no idea at that time what I was going to do with my life. I just needed a job, like most undergrads do. And I got a job with child welfare in Colorado Springs. And it was an eye-opening experience for me.
Aren't we all of it? Because I saw Lana to Colorado.
Mo, you need to mute yourself.
I was 25 years old, and I was placed in a unit that was called the Parent-Child Conflict Resolution Unit. Basically, what that unit of social workers did was children who were removed from their homes overnight or on the weekends through an emergency response removal were placed in temporary foster care. And we were responsible for bringing the family and the child together, and anybody that family wanted to be a part of that discussion, and to try to have a discussion really about what was the conflict that led us here, and what did we need to do to resolve it. So they were not your typical physical or sexual abuse cases, because those were pretty clear cut in terms of what was needed to be done. These were more parent-child conflicts. So at 25, it felt very odd for me to be telling parents what to do to resolve conflicts with their children. I had no children of my own. I felt I was barely a child myself. So it was an interesting experience, to say the least. But one of the things it did, exposed me to so many things that really I was very sheltered in my life. I didn't have a lot of exposure to child abuse or neglect. And so what I was seeing and what I was experiencing in that job became very overwhelming to me very quickly. And in my career as a child welfare professional, I saw this happen with staff that I supervised and managed over and over again. When you don't come to this field with a lot of experience around child abuse or neglect, it's not something that's part of who you were, you weren't exposed to it. It's difficult and it's challenging, and it really tears at your soul. So after 2 years of doing that, I said, I can't do this anymore. This just isn't for me. And I left child welfare, and I did other forms of case management. I did case management with elderly, blind, and disabled, alternative to nursing home care, for 2 years. And then I decided to come back home. My family's in Southern California. I wanted to be in California. I came back home and decided to go get my master's degree. And while I was doing that, I worked for the regional centers. So I worked with developmentally delayed infants, 0 to 5-year-olds, basically. So I got a feel for case management, social work in different environments and what that was like. And in the process of going through my graduate degree, the realization came to me that the place where I was working at the time wasn't the place I needed to continue to work. I was ethically and philosophically, I was in conflict with their process about what they believed in services for families were all about. They really focused on withholding services where I was trying to get services. So I was in conflict with that. But I also had this thing in the back of my head that was drawing me back to child welfare. And it was something about that experience that was challenging, but it was exciting. It was pulling me back. And so I decided to apply to Riverside County, and I got hired with Riverside County as a social worker, and started my child welfare career all over again there. I started as a social worker, and I worked the continuing services, providing reunification and family maintenance and permanency planning services to families and youth, kids. And then I did dependency investigations, where I actually did the biopsychosocial assessments and decided, what was going to be the case plan for the families. And then I promoted to supervisor, and I supervised that. I had done emergency response in Colorado, so I was familiar with emergency response. I was able to supervise that. And somewhere along the line, I met Lori, and she kind of dragged me into the training arena, and I started training with her, and that ended up being a life of its own in terms of just becoming a trainer. I did a lot of training on the side for our Public Child Welfare Training Academy, and I ended up being in charge of training for a while. Lori moved on to a different position, and I took her position, being a trainer. And then we both moved into management, and eventually I became the assistant director in Riverside County. So I spent 21 years in Riverside County, at all different levels, doing different things. And I'll tell you, one of the things that I love about the field of child welfare is there's so much you can do. There's so much opportunity to do different things. If you get stuck in a front end doing investigations and that's not your thing, you can move to, adoptions, or you can move to working with family reunification, or you can be a trainer. You can help train, or you can write policy, or you can do contracts. I mean, there's just so much that you could do. And so for me, I was the type of person that moved jobs every 2 years. And it was a great environment for me to thrive in, because I needed that challenge in my professional career. I needed to be challenged all the time. I wanted, once I knew something, I wanted to move on and learn something else. And child welfare, especially in Riverside County, gave me that opportunity and gave me the ability to do that. And even now, when I talk to folks, I do coaching of child welfare directors now. And when I talk to them, that they still feel that that's a possibility in child welfare, that you could still, move around and do a lot of things. So that's kind of, that's how I got back there. That's, I did the things that I did. I was fortunate in that I really had good bosses, and I had bosses that were willing to let me challenge them about things that I didn't either I didn't agree with them, or and to challenge the system. There were things that I would come upon in the organization, in the agency, that I just weren't right. They just weren't right, and I would challenge those things, and I got a reputation for that. And that's not always good. Some people hold that against you, when you're challenging things, but that was my way. was to challenge the things that I thought were not right. And so that's what I did. And that's the same way I felt about families in the child welfare system, because sometimes families aren't always treated right. And so you got to advocate for them, whether it's the court's not treating them right, or their service providers, or, your coworker. You really got to advocate for our families. The system in general doesn't support the families who come through the system itself. So as much as we go into this field wanting to help people and to be an advocate for them and support them, sometimes the system doesn't do that. So you really have to you have to really push it sometimes. So in that process of really moving into a management and an administrative level, one of the areas that became very close to my heart. I'm Native, and one of the areas I was very concerned about was the Indian Child Welfare Act, and that became an area of specialty for me. I trained the Indian Child Welfare Act. I presented all over the state of California on the Indian Child Welfare Act, and we did a lot of innovative things both in Riverside County and in San Francisco around implementation of the Indian Child Welfare Act. So in Riverside County, there are so many tribes that it took, I would say, and relationships between government agencies and tribes are not good. And even though I'm Native, I represent the government. So you don't just get a pass just because you're Native. You work for the government, right? So it took a long time to really build relationships with the tribes, but we were able to establish some really good relationships working with tribes in Southern California. We would partner with the tribes that had social services programs. We would partner with them on our investigations when we would ask at the hotline if there was Indian heritage, and we would contact the tribe and connect with tribal social services and do joint investigations and joint home visits. And it was really a way of really being true to the Indian Child Welfare Act, because the tribe needs to be involved from the very beginning. And that work was really, real important to me. But it was real important to the tribes and to the children of the tribes. So that was really good opportunity. And in San Francisco, I always wanted to do big city. I always wanted to do an urban environment of child welfare, because urban environments have a lot of resources and a lot of money. And so you can do a lot of things. And so I had applied in the past to LA County, not being successful there in getting a job there. So the opportunity came up to go to San Francisco, and I applied, and I got the job. And so I moved up here. And one of the first things I asked the staff was, what are your tribal relationships like? What's your work with the Indian child welfare community look like? And their response to me was, oh, we don't have any Indians in San Francisco. And of course, I was like, well, really, I can walk down the street and I see all kinds of Native people, and they see me. And, what does that mean? So they really didn't know the history. The workers in San Francisco didn't know the history of California Natives. They didn't know the history of the Bay Area and how important that was. And so we started doing some work around there, and educated them about that. But one of the things we were able to do in San Francisco that I wasn't able to do in Riverside was we hired a genealogist who would, once we identified a child was a Native child and they weren't enrolled in their tribe, we hired a genealogist who would do the research, connect them to their tribe, and get them enrolled in their tribe. And if they were older youth, and they were youth that were not eligible for enrollment, but they wanted a connection to the tribe, she would make those connections for them so that they would have those lifelong connections, and they would learn their culture and their heritage and their tribal customs and ceremonies, and we would facilitate visits to their tribes. So that was really a unique experience, I think, for San Francisco. And they're still doing that work. I retired in 2018, and they're still doing that work, which is very unique. It's no other, there's no, we presented at the National Indian Child Welfare Conference a couple years ago, and there's no other state that's doing that work. That's really, there are counties that have county workers that do that, but they're not necessarily hiring somebody like a genealogist to do that. And she was a native person, so she already knew what a lot of these contexts were, because she works in that environment. So that was really good. So it was exciting. It was exciting work. Being a child welfare director is a tough job, but it was a very rewarding job. It was a very rewarding career, and I would not give it up I would not, change that decision ever. I love the work. But one of the things that I think I realized probably right before I left Riverside County, I really began to understand the child welfare system as a system, and understand, and I'm going to just understand, because I wasn't ready to accept it. Understand that the child welfare system was built on oppression, the concepts of oppression, the concepts of destroying families, and specifically destroying families of color and families in poverty, and disrupting families of color. And when your whole career is committed to child welfare, and you're the director of child welfare in 2 separate counties, and you come to that realization, it's pretty overwhelming, because I had to question what I was doing. I'm basically part of the problem. I'm enforcing the systemic racism that this system was built on, and that continues. And so at that point, I think I had to get to a point where I could accept it. And in order to accept it, I had to say, how can I change it? So that's like my next mission, right? That is what I've been working on since I left. I think it was that was the impetus for letting me come to the decision to retire. I didn't feel like I could continue to work in the system and do the work that I wanted to do in the field of child welfare anymore, being in the system. I had to be out of it. So when I retired, I was able to become a consultant and a trainer. I train ICWA all over the state for new social workers, but I also get to train tribal social services people. And so I get to see both sides of what the issues are. But the other things I get to do is I get to do work that really addresses the issues of racial equity, and trying to see what it is that we need to do in child welfare to turn it, to change it, to make it so that we're not just destroying families, and we're not just destroying families of color and families in poverty, but that we're really helping them. So for me, the Families First Act out of the Federal Families First Prevention Services Act is an opportunity for us in California, certainly, to really look at that and to really say, what is it that families need, and how do we help them? It's an opportunity for us to really redefine what we're doing in child welfare around child abuse and neglect. Child abuse is very different than child neglect, and child neglect needs to be redefined, and child neglect needs to be addressed differently. We don't need to bring children into foster care simply because we think they're being neglected. What is it that's missing in those families? What is it that those families need that we can give them, that we as communities can come together and support them, so that they're not having to come into the child welfare system? And probably you know as well as I do that these are communities of color, our African American communities, our Native American communities, our Latino communities. They the COVID, I think, experience we've had over the last year has really demonstrated that, right? We see how communities of color are being impacted at a higher rate with COVID than any other community. And it's like that with everything. Now we see it with the vaccinations. They're saying that they want communities of color to be the first communities to get the vaccinations because they're being hit the hardest. But yet that's not what's happening now. What's happening now is it's white people that are getting the vaccinations, right? So how do we begin to address some of those issues? And I think in the role I'm in now as a consultant, as a trainer, I can better work towards addressing those issues. I was instrumental in the work around the development and implementation of the core practice model for child welfare services in the state of California. And right now we're doing some incredible work to really look at the issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and where does that fit in terms of the core practice model, and how do we integrate the concepts of diversity, equity, and inclusion, you know, the concepts of white supremacy, the concepts of worshiping the written word, which is all part of white supremacy, into the core practice model, so that when we're talking about our practice with families, our biases are being identified more readily and upfront, and we're not punishing families because they're poor, or punishing them because their culture is different, their beliefs are different, or their access to services and resources in our communities is different. It's not fair, right? It's just not fair. So that's what I think the future of child welfare should be focused on. I know that I wanted to get to that point, is what do I think should be the next step for child welfare? And I think the Families First Act is something that gives us a start to start addressing these issues. There's some national work being done and state work being done across the nation on changing the definition of neglect in order to better meet, design a set of services associated with the Families First Prevention Act to address these issues of neglect, and focus resources on communities that are overrepresented in the foster care system, so we can start keeping them out of the foster care system. We don't raise children well in this foster care system. We have horrible outcomes, and all the data shows it. So what do we do to better connect these families to the resources and services that they need? And that's where I really think the system needs to take a very close look at itself, needs to start looking at its practices and its policies, and really addressing those issues of how do we increase our diversity, how do we increase inclusivity in our ranks in terms of all levels of staffing in the organization, but also how do we provide a more equitable process for families that come before our attention. So that would be my dream for the future, is that we really could change the child welfare system from what it is now to something that's much more focused on keeping families together, providing families with services and resources to connect them to their communities, and to strengthen them, to make them more healthy, and keep them out of the foster care system. So that's my spiel. Questions? Larkin.
Yeah, so I thought it was really interesting when you were talking about neglect. And I remember reading in our book that neglect is a product of different stressors that the parents are going through. So I was wondering what you thought the biggest stressor was from parents that you saw going through neglect with their children, and then how you addressed it.
I think the biggest stressors for neglect are really poverty and a lack of resources. So, what you see in communities of poverty is you see a lot of liquor stores. You don't see a lot of grocery stores. You see a lot of, that's the businesses that are supported. You don't see the resources that families need, that like one of the things they have in San Francisco are what we call family resource centers. And San Francisco is very small. It's 7 miles by 7 miles, right? It's very, very small. They have 26 family resource centers. So imagine in any community you're in, there's a family resource center. That's what families that are experiencing neglect, poverty, and a lack of resources and services available to them need to have some place to go to get those kinds of things. And I think that when you're struggling with poverty, when you're struggling to put food on the table or to pay the rent or to pay the lights, it's very easy to get caught up in things that take your mind off of that. And that's substance abuse, right? So we see so many families in the child welfare system caught up in substance abuse. But if you remove some of those stressors, many people will not use substances if you take away those stressors, because those things are just there. They're things that people do to take away the pain that they're feeling as a result of what they're experiencing. So I think for me as a social worker and working with those families, I think my biggest effort was in trying to find them those resources and connect them to those resources. And as a worker, I did whatever I could do. I know if you guys know anything about the Indian Child Welfare Act, it's really focused on active efforts. Active efforts is the gold standard for child welfare. Every family should receive active efforts. And what that means is we as social workers should do everything we can. If a family doesn't know how to use a bus and to transfer from bus line to bus line, what good does giving them a bus pass do? Right? If a family doesn't understand the concept of one-on-one counseling, that's not normal in their culture or their experience, what good is a referral to counseling going to do them? How can we figure out from them what it is that works for them and then try to find that service? And I think that's our job as social workers, is to really ask, inquire from the family, what works for you? What would you do? What do you do when you have struggles? What do you usually do to help you get out of it? And then start building off of that, because families have strengths. They don't, they're not hitting the bottom all the time. There's lots of things that they do that are positive. So really drawing that out from them and then trying to move forward and find them those services and resources.
Thank you.
Let me see. I've seen going to the chat. You're welcome. Mark asks, when a child is neglected and removed from the family, does the family often have a change of heart and try to change in order to get the child back, or do they often remain the same? You know what? It really depends, Mark. It really depends. For a substance abusing dynamic, I think it's really hard to address you have to address the substance abuse before you can address anything else. And so the parent has to be really, really wanting to address that issue in order to address the neglect that is a result of their substance use, right? That's usually what neglect is the result of, if they're a substance abusing parent. So they have to be willing to do that. If a family is experiencing neglect because of a lack of resources just to do the basics of living, whether it's, you know, paying the rent or paying the water bill and the electric bill, keeping the electric on, being able to feed their family, that feels like a no-win situation. And I don't think anybody really wants to stay in that. If you give them the opportunity to obtain resources and services to get them out of that, they will change. That will change. It's just when you don't feel you have the opportunities. So I'm going to just, if you think about some of our communities of color, if you don't think that you're going to be able to get the resources that you need because they're not available in your community, it's not that you don't want to change, it's that you can't. You know, how are you kids, there's that saying, you know, pick yourself up by your bootstraps, and just, you know that you can't just pick up yourself by your bootstraps when you don't have the resources, or you don't have access to the resources to change. So I think that it depends on what the issue is, and I think it's incumbent on the field of child welfare, if they're child welfare families, but social services in general, to really look at how do we instill in our communities the services and resources that families need to be successful, and how do we make sure that those resources are available to everybody that needs them, and they're accessible. So available and accessible. I don't know if that answered the question, but another question: what are the best ways college students like us can help families and children who are struggling with neglect and other child welfare issues? College students like you. Oh, you're so young. Well, I think there's a lot of things you can do. For one, you guys have a lot of networks, right? You have a lot of personal networks. So I'm going to tell you, the number one need in child welfare are foster parents, resource families. There are not enough foster parents and resource families for the kids that need to be taken care of. So if every single one of you reached out to your own networks, and you got one foster family, one family who said, hey, I'll become a foster parent, that's what looks like maybe at least 12, if not more, I can't count that fast, new foster homes in a community, right? I think the other thing is being aware of what the issues are, and what the like knowing about bills that are passed around child welfare issues, or legislation that's pending that impacts child welfare, and being able to advocate to folks at your age level to support stuff like that, right? Like sometimes we see things go on the ballot, on the voting ballot, and a lot of young people don't vote. And so how do you get people to pay attention to that, right? Pay attention to the political process, pay attention to stuff that's available in your communities, that you can educate others about, so that they can participate in that process too. Because a lot of young people don't want to. I have a daughter that's 26, and it's harder than heck to get her to pay attention to what's going on around her, you know. So it's really you being aware, and then sharing that with your own networks. But I think the biggest thing you can do is really try to explain to the folks that you know around you, especially people that might be a little older than you and have the opportunity to provide a foster home for a child, and to recruit them to pursue that. That would be good. Let me see another question. First off, I'd like to say thank you for providing insight and your experience. My question is, how do you emotionally disconnect? And do you feel like you ever brought your work home and it emotionally affect you? That's a good question, because heck yeah, you bring it home all the time. Right? I'll tell you a story. When Lori and I first got promoted to manager, we got promoted at the very same time. And she lucked out because she got stuck in the Riverside office. They put me in Indio, Coachella. I didn't live in Indio, Coachella. I lived in Riverside. So it was a 60-minute commute. But I did it. But I remember coming home one night, and I was always bringing my work home, right? There's always stuff to do. I was always bringing work home. And my daughter was about 4 at the time. And I was sitting on the couch with all these folders around me, and she picked up my work and she threw it across the room. And she said, "I hate your work. I hate your job. All you ever do is work, work." And I remember that so clearly because it was such a wake-up call for me in terms of my own ability to let the work go and to leave it at work and to be there for my kids and my family when they needed to. And it's unfortunate, I think, that it took that for me to realize that, but it changed the way I did my work. And in child welfare, certainly, I mean, especially as a director or a manager, you have to be available all the time because stuff happens all the time. But so I took the opportunity at that point to really explain to my children what I did. And even though they were young, I continued to explain what I did. And what they knew as they grew up is that mom helped children who needed help. You know, and then it got clearer as they got older, but for them, it was all about moms helping children. And so once they understood better what I did, they understood that time that I needed to take away from them. But I still made that extra effort to really try to disconnect. And when I'm home and pay attention to my family. Emotionally, this stuff really it's tough. It's tough. And I always, I remember telling Lori many times, because she not always agree with me on this, but I feel like we get crusty. You know, I get this little crusty little shell around us to protect us from the stuff that we see, the stuff that we read, the stuff that we hear. It's hard, but it's not everybody can do it. And so knowing whether you can do that and maintain that emotional distance is important in this work. So if you're pursuing your master's in social work and you feel like you can't do that, then it's okay if you don't choose child welfare. There's lots of things to do in social work. It's okay if you can't do that. And I still experience that because I do what they call Gomez hearings right now. When somebody gets substantiated abuse and gets listed on the Child Abuse and Neglect Index, they can appeal that. So I do hearings and so I'm reading these, you know, I'm back in that world of reading these cases, what happened to the child and, you know, what the parent did. And then I'm doing these hearings. So, but I'm in a different place in my career and in my life now. It's a lot easier for me to do that separation and that disconnect. And I think when I told you my first 2 years were overwhelming to me and I had to leave child welfare, that's exactly why I had to leave. I didn't think the work was for me because it was really hard emotionally on me. I came back to it because it was my love. It's the one thing that kept me challenged and excited. But you have to be at the place where you can make that separation and disconnect from what you're doing at work to what you're doing at home. Where should we go after we graduate? The field or college? I love this question. Both answers are right. The field is good for the experience. You can get on to a child welfare agency, not in the Bay Area. In the Bay Area, they have a overabundance of graduates up here with graduate degrees. And so most of the counties up here require a graduate degree before you can get into child welfare, or you're coming in at like an aide position, an assistant, social service assistant. but the experience that you get in the field is so valuable, and really helps, I think, inform your graduate education. I think you go into your graduate education with a very different perspective when you've already done the work a little bit. And so I'm biased towards that. That's just a bias of my own, is that having that experience in the field really helps you in your graduate degree. I think it helps you understand the work better and make a better choice about where you go once you graduate. But that's just me. I mean, I've seen people do it the both ways and be amazing social workers. So it's just a preference that you have to make. Let's see. If a family wants to foster a child with a different culture than their own, what do you suggest is the best course of action for these families to support these kids? The best thing to do is to have a child and family team meeting with everybody there, right? First of all, I think as a foster parent, if you want to foster children, you should not be afraid of the parents. You should want to have a relationship with the parents. You should want to know all about their kids and their lives and what they do with their kids and what makes their kids happy and what do their kids like to eat. And that you, as a foster parent, could be the best support person for that parent. Because if that parent knows that you're taking care of their child in the way they would, and that you're there to support them along the way, they're more likely to be successful. So I would want to know that parent. I would want to reach out to that parent. I would want to know all about that child from that parent's perspective. And then I would want to know what they do as a family. What do they do with the children? And how can I continue those activities? What are the things, maybe like, I know this is, once again, the Indian Child Welfare Act requires this of foster parents, but we should be doing this for all children. We should be finding out with those families, what is it that you guys do on the weekends? What are the places the kids like to go? And then you should be doing those, right? Maybe you could even invite the parents to go with you and do that with the parents. Wouldn't that be good, right? So it's really important, if you're going to be a foster parent, not to be afraid of the parents. We don't agree with what these parents do. I mean, nobody does. I don't agree with what the parents do to their kids, but these kids love their parents. And most of the time, 99% of the time, these kids want to be with their parents. They love them. How do we facilitate that? How do we make that happen? If I'm going to take your children to the zoo, hey, can you come with me to the zoo? Let's do this together. They can learn from you as a foster parent. So I think that's what you do is you find out from the family what works for them and what are their interests and what do they do, and then you join with them in taking care of those kids. How have your limitations, if you have any, yes, of course I do, influenced your development as a social worker? That's a good question. Well, what my biggest limitation is my mouth. I think everybody needs to know what's going on inside this head, whether it's nice or not. And so that's always been my biggest limitation, is I feel like I need to share my opinion with everybody, whether they want to hear it or not. And I have had to learn. I have made many, many mistakes, and I have hurt many people. That's the reality, is I have hurt many people because I was not cognizant of that and I didn't care. And so that it did limit me. It created challenges for me in trying to promote, and it created challenges in my leadership where people questioned my leadership because of those experiences. And so I think that has helped me in my development as a social worker, because I think I'm a better human being as a result of that. And that makes me a better social worker. I'm more caring about people. I'm more caring about how they feel. And I'm more caring about what my impact is on other people. Do you want me to keep answering, Lori? Okay. One of my biggest conflicts is deciding whether to work for a system built on oppression and white supremacy. Is there such a thing from working on the inside to create change? How long does it take for the outcomes and changes that you wanted to happen after challenging your work and department? Yeah, that's a big dilemma. I agree with you, but I do think you can change it from the inside. I do. I think that this is the time. Now is the time to do this. I think people are open to hearing it. I think people are open to talking about it. And I think that systems are willing to look at themselves and begin to address this issue. You just have to be bold enough to want to do it. And you have to be bold enough to want to have those conversations with other people. And we hear a lot about having those conversations with other people. And it's not people of color that need to have these conversations with people of color, because we have these conversations all the time. It's white people that need to have the conversations with everyone. It really is. And I don't mean that to be offensive. It's just a reality. And I think if you're willing to have those conversations, then those changes can happen, because you begin to talk about what needs to change in order for us to really feel like we're all feeling more equal, more inclusive, So I think that's the challenge. And I think that it takes a while to see outcomes. It's just a matter of how persistent you are to continue and continue and continue. But if you're persistent with it, you'll see things change. You'll definitely see things change. You mentioned you were able to work in many different areas. If we wanted to do the same, would we need more schooling to go into another area? No, I don't think so. I at one point, because of just circumstances, sometimes you have bad bosses, and I had a bad boss for a period of time. And I made a decision to leave child welfare, and I took a deputy director position in human resources. And I didn't know any, I was over safety, workman's comp, and risk management for the entire county of Riverside. I knew nothing about that stuff. I had no idea what I was doing, but I was able to take that job, and I was able to do a lot of things, because as a leader, your job is getting work done through others. So I had people who could teach me about that work. I'm a quick study, and really they're the ones that need to do the work. So all you got to do is be a leader to them, right? But you don't need more school. You just need to be willing to try. Do you ever interact with schools when working with cases? If so, what are the main reasons for these interactions, and what level of office do you work with? I don't work with the schools at all. Certainly social workers work with schools all the time, right? That's a regular part of your job. And they're the biggest mandated reporter of all. Okay, so most of the reporting about child abuse and neglect comes from the schools. You will not believe how many times I've seen investigations where the social workers never talked to the reporting party that was the teacher. Talk to the teacher. It's important. Talk to the reporting party. That's so important. They see these children every day. Every day. The other thing is, even though teachers are the number one reporting party, they also over-report children of color. So it's an opportunity for us to understand what lens they're viewing this from, so that we can have a better understanding of what the real issue is, right? But I personally don't get to work with the schools, but you as anybody that goes as a social worker in child welfare would work a lot with the schools. Is it difficult to separate personal experiences and beliefs from work? I don't think you can separate personal experience and beliefs from work easily. I don't think that's an easy thing to do. And I don't know that you can necessarily do that. That's what's so important. It's not about separating it. It's about recognizing it, understanding it, and controlling it, managing it, right? So I have a lot of biases. I'm sure I do. I won't sit here and tell you what they are, but you have to recognize in yourself that you have that belief, or what I would call a bias, or that belief, and that it may not be the same as somebody else's. You recognize that it is there, and that understand that it may have a different or a negative. It could have a negative impact on somebody else. It could have a positive impact, but you got to know that that belief or that bias will have some kind of an impact. And so how do you manage that? How do you stay on top of that? How do you pull yourself out of that to look at it differently? This is why the process of child and family teams, or family group conferencing, or supervision is so important in the field of social work, to help get a different perspective, so that your bias is not the only thing driving whatever the decision is, right? So you want to make sure that you're in consultation with someone else, and they hopefully can see if that bias is there. But even if they don't see it, at least they're giving you their perspective, which may be different than yours. So really work on trying to understand your own beliefs, your own biases, and to be able to recognize when you're putting them in front of you, or in front of a decision you're making, because that's what's important. How do you know what is the right thing to say to someone you're helping? Was there a moment where you were unsure how to respond to someone or a situation? Absolutely. You don't know if you're saying the right thing, and you won't always know. You won't always know. The most important thing in social work is relationship. If I have a relationship with you, you're more likely going to open up to me and talk to me. If I genuinely demonstrate that I care about you, you are more likely to open up to me and to develop a relationship with me, right? So I'm going to tell you, I had a case when I was in Riverside, a social worker, and this was a mother. She was a single mom. She was white. And she was an older mom. She was like 40, and she had a girl. So the girl was like 5, and she had had her kind of later, maybe like 35. And she was an alcoholic, a bad alcoholic. And she had put her child at risk. And that's why we had a case on her. And I remember being in her home with her, and we were talking about what she needed to do in order to really work towards getting her child back home. And this child was everything to her. That's all she had, was this child. And while we were talking, I saw that moment where she realized that she was struggling with this addiction that she had. She was struggling with this addiction so much that she just didn't know how to get out of it to help her child. You could see that. And she got very emotional and very tearful. And she was I mean, I just sat there looking at her for a moment, and it was very emotional for me to watch her go through that, to the point where I got very emotional. And of course, as a social worker, and you're like, oh my God, I can't cry with this one. That's not the right thing to do. But you have to catch that, right? So there's lots of times when you're going to experience stuff like that. And that was one of the times I experienced something like that. There were other times. But what I did want her to know from me is that I understood, that I had empathy around that struggle that she was experiencing and how hard that was for her. And I wanted her to see that. I didn't want to cry with her, but I wanted her to know that I was feeling that pain with her, and that I was going to be there for her to try to help her through that. And that's all you can do, is try to, if you can create relationships with people where they can feel confident enough about how genuine you are, that they can share that level of pain with you, then all you need to do is be there for them, because they'll feel that. They'll feel it, and they'll understand that it's real, right? Mo's question is the last. That was Mo's question. That's the last question. Those were great questions, you guys. Yeah.
Great questions, great discussion. I'm going to stop recording.